have trouble now preaching this sermon because I told David 24, I think, and he read 25, chapter 25. But it's an interesting thing because Drusilla, I'm going to make the connect. Y'all don't think I can't watch. Drusilla was kin to Bernice. Drusilla was not a very nice lady. She was a Jewish lady, but she was married to a Gentile, Felix. And if you look at 24, chapter 24, you will notice there that Paul is going to go before Felix and he's going to start talking to him. And right before he gets there, his wife, in verse 24, Drusilla, who was a Jewish, he sent for Paul concerning her to hear him about the faith in Christ. Now this lady was not a real nice lady, and she fit just perfect with Felix because he was not a nice man. He had used a sorcerer, which I don't know if that was effective or not, but Drusilla must have thought so because she left her first husband. She was promised Antiochus Epiphanes, and we know his history, ended up marrying the king of Emesa, and I can't say his name, Azizes or something like that, but anyway, she was wooed away from her husband to be with Felix, so they didn't belong together. They weren't married properly. Even in their culture, people didn't recognize it as being really just, but of course in that culture, like ours, anything went. And so therefore, this kind of tells you a little something about Felix. Now, it's one of those things where no matter who you are or where you are, that pesky logic and common sense tends to get in the way a lot. And what we're finding here in this discussion that Paul has with Felix, and a lot of people, and there's a great 3-point sermon, he reasoned with him about righteousness, self-control, and judgment. That's a great 3-point sermon, I'm not doing that one. What I'm doing is the one that gets to that. Right before that, it says he reasoned about these things. I want you to notice these things: righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come. These are reasonable things. There is not one facet of Christianity that is not common sense, reasonable, just smart. We live in a world that has ridiculed and demeaned and makes jokes about and mocks Christianity. And one of the things, ironically, they mock Christianity about is its silliness and its uselessness and the fact it's just not smart to be a Christian. And that's just the opposite of what it is. Paul sat down with this guy whose reputation was known far and wide, and he reasoned with him about these things. Now, what is interesting is that you can sit down about things like righteousness, being right, or being the fact that there is such a thing as something right, and that you should be right. You have an oughtness about you that you need to do what's right. He's righteousness, self-control. Wow. That's a sermon, that's a lectureship all by itself, just on the notion of our culture and our country and who we are today in this country, and self-control, which is nearly void. We are such an instant gratification culture society. That's who we are. And I'm not against convenience, don't get me wrong. As much as I hate devices and computers and stuff, they are so handy. I wonder sometimes if I'd even have a memory if it were not for my iPhone. Because I can't remember where I'm supposed to be and what I'm supposed to be doing if I don't have it on my calendar where I can get to it right quick. I remember my dad working as a preacher. He'd go around and he always had this little notebook in his pocket. And I asked him one time, "What is that in your pocket?" And he said, "That's my mind." I understand what he meant now. Because but it's so much more convenient with the devices we have in technology. But you know, we live in a culture where we've gotten to think that easy is always the way to go. And that can't be the case if you understand Matthew 7:13 and 14. Because the easy way is the wrong way. We just don't live in a place where we're told, you know what, if you'll delay that pleasure response a little bit, stifle it some, it will pay off later on if you'll get control of yourself. It is a reasonable thing. Self-control is one of those things that are reasonable. And judgment. You know, that is one of the, in fact, it was brought up in class this morning. I was really appreciating that class this morning but the idea that people that don't want to have God in their knowledge reject what God has to say, and it wasn't brought up, but I thought about during the course of the time that we were having our study, isn't it the case also that most people don't want to believe in God because of accountability? Isn't that the case? We don't want to be accountable for actions, and if there is a God, and as 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians says, we're going to be judged by our works, isn't that a frightening thing for people who don't want to be accountable for the works they've done? We were discussing a while ago the idea of, if you've been forgiven, you're still going to be judged by your works, but how does that work? Because we've been forgiven, the works that we've done, things that we didn't do right, are we going to be judged for those? Not with Christ's blood covering us, because we've been forgiven of those sins. But can you imagine if you don't have that forgiveness? The works that will be judged and the accountability one would have? It is a logical and reasonable thing to believe there is accountability. Why, even in our laws of physics, and that's the thing, in common sense, common rules in our lives, the world we live in, there is a push and a pull. There is always an equal and opposite reaction to anything. There are physics laws that talk about accountability. If you do this, this is going to happen. In logic, there is accountability. If, then, are arguments that are made constantly. Very logical arguments. That pesky reason just gets in the way when it comes to living a Christian life. And part of the reason that Satan, through his emissaries, mocks Christianity's intelligence and reason and ratiocinacity, the reason they do that, because they don't want you to think Christianity is reasonable, because then you might come to the conclusion it's not smart to be an atheist. Well, that sounds very much like Psalm 14:1 to me. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Well, indeed, it is smart to be a Christian. And which proves, by the way, his audience, Felix. I don't care where you are, how bad you get, if you can reason with somebody, and you can use reason to get to them. Now, I understand there's some folks that don't reason. They don't, you get in an argument, pick your side, your subject, they'll argue with you. They're just not reasonable people. I understand there's folks like that. Some people just won't see it. But if you can get someone to just look at it and think about it. I've spent a lot of time in my ministry trying to get people to accept the truth, and I think I've gone about it wrong. I'm beginning to realize I don't need to get them to accept the truth. That's something they have to do on their own. I shouldn't push that. I need to water and I need to plant. Or the other way around. I need to plant. That's why I don't garden, folks, okay? I need to plant and then I need to water. And so therefore, when you plant and you water, then God gives the increase, because people will, when they sit down and look at it, will reasonably see the truth. Then they have an opportunity to choose whether or not they're going to follow the truth or not. But folks, this fella here, as repugnant as he was, and I'm not going to get off into an essay on Felix, because, he's a horrible guy. But even as bad as he was, he had the capacity to reason. And Paul's emphasis here was to teach him in a reasonable fashion these things that were lacking in his life that created the Felix that he was. But I want you to note that he was teaching him about these things because he wanted him to be different than who he was, and Felix had that capacity. I think sometimes we look at folks, we might look at folks like Felix and go, whew, those are sorry boogers. There ain't no sense even talking to them. Why in the world would you waste your time? Because look at the way they live. Folks, that's the wrong way to look at these precious souls for whom Jesus died. We need to look at anybody who is willing or able to be reasonable and rational, and we need to be able to approach them in some way to reason with them about righteousness, self-control, and judgment. He was a potential. A lot of people don't look at other folks like that. A lot of Christians don't look at folks like that. We should. If they're not Christians, they're a potential Christian. Christ died for them. The last point I would make is Felix's response. This is sad. In fact, most of the time, they're Almost Persuaded is sung about the guy that David just read about. I always figured that would be a song about Felix too. I'll call you at a convenient time. One of these days, I may write me a church song. I'll call you at a convenient time. What a great invitation song. The convenient time is right now. right now is the convenient time. And Felix didn't realize that. In fact, really what he was saying is, I don't want to hear it anymore. Now, I've been told that verbatim. I don't want to hear it anymore. And that's a pretty sad thing. And of course, too, you'll notice that Paul, he just clung to him and hung on to him and said, no, I ain't done yet. No, he didn't do that. I think sometimes it takes time for people to process. I don't believe Felix was really open-minded about this, but you know what is strange about that? If you read further on, they were hoping to get some money from Paul because they knew Paul was being supported by some of the churches, but they sent for him more often and conversed with him. You ever wonder about that? This is after Felix had told him, I'll call you at a convenient time. Did a convenient time just pop up later on? Yeah, I wondered about that because later on, they have him in their presence, and not just for once or twice, but several times, long enough that he finally got out of office and somebody took over, but he was left in prison in chains. Okay? I don't know whether Paul made a dent or not, but this much I know, Paul didn't quit and he didn't give up. Therefore, in verse 26, the last part, he sent for him more often and conversed with him. You know, when somebody brushes you off, our inclination very often to say, well, I tried. And that's a great out, isn't it? I mean, I did try, but, you know, they didn't want to hear it, so I quit. I'm just not going to press them. Okay, fine. But they're still breathing, and there's still hope, and there's still something, maybe, if you're thinking about it, you could do to strike up a conversation again. What is amazing to me is he kept coming. We don't ever read of, and it's been said many times, we don't ever read of Felix' conversion, okay? I look at verse 26 and take a different view. I know that 2 years later, Festus took over, and he succeeded Felix. And Felix, he wanted to get along with the Jews. Everybody wanted to get along with the Jews. He left Paul bound. But you know where Paul was and the way he looked at things. I don't know if that was a great problem with Paul. I mean, they stuck him in the Roman prison. He converted part of Caesar's family. I mean, that's just the way Paul worked. He made hay while the sun was shining, wherever he was. But I look at, therefore, he sent for him more often and conversed with him. Really, after he told him, I'll call you at a convenient season, he was still calling him to come back and talk to him. As long as somebody is willing to talk to you, that's why I say when you talk to people, try not to burn bridges. Try not to just close the door. If they will talk to you and reason with you, most people don't like being dumb. I can't speak for anybody in here but me. I hate being dumb. I don't mind being ignorant, but I don't want to stay that way because I'm pretty ignorant about some things. But being dumb is just not flattering. And I don't like being dumb. So when somebody corrects my way of thinking and I can be not dumb, then I like that. I can't help but believe Felix wanted to hear Paul because the things he was saying, as much as they made him fear, and you look at verse 25, he was afraid. This is a word here in the Greek. It's not just a respect and an awe. No, he was scared to death. And well, he should have been the way he was living. But you know, people who see and hear the truth, sometimes that's the reaction they have. They realize, man, that's not who I am. It's not the way I'm living, and I know I should change my way. But he kept calling him back. As long as you have audience, there's hope. I never give up on anybody as long as they're breathing. Now, I may be very cautious about how I, as a good steward of God's gifts, I'm going to use my time in the way that I believe is most effective. But when somebody asks a question, I want to be ready to give an answer for the hope that lies within me. That being the case, if somebody is willing to converse with me, I want to converse with them. I know we have no record of his conversion. I concede that immediately. But I have as much right to decide, out of speculation, like you might, or some might, oh, he never converted, you know. Well, you don't know that any more than I know he did. But I'm looking at verse 26 saying, you know what? He kept calling old Paul back. Maybe he converted at some point in time. We just don't know. Would it surprise you to see Felix in heaven? I mean, there's a lot of folks that are going to be surprised to see in heaven. I know that when I get there, there's going to be people shaking their head, go, how'd you make it? Well, same way you did, by the blood of Christ. That's the only way we're going to make it. But I guarantee you this, reasoning with people who are willing to talk is the way we can convert people. It is intelligent to be a Christian. It's smart to be a Christian. And when people figure that out and they have the opportunity to respond, isn't it going to be wonderful one day to hear them say at the judgment, I wouldn't be here except that you took the time, you cared enough for my soul to say, hey, you're important. Let's invest some time and some reason and change what may have been a hopeless life into something that's really, really good. A lot of times we make prejudgments, we have to be very, very careful how we prejudge people. I know Felix doesn't have any record of being converted, but I've been. Regardless, I know Paul spent time with him, teaching him about righteousness and self-control and the judgment to come. Now, we need to pay attention to those things too. If you're not a Christian this evening, you need to be, please be baptized. If you are a Christian, you need to respond. Then we offer the invitation song so that you might do so. As we stand together, we sing.